Rachel Zegler's back. Yeah, she's back in the headlines. And somehow, after one of Disney's most embarrassing live action disasters, the lesson she seems to have taken from all this is not, maybe I should have handled that differently. No. The lesson appears to be, actually, I was right. Everyone else was wrong. And also, I'm still the victim. And that, my friends, is why this story refuses to die. Because the new Rachel Zegler interview over in Harper's Bazaar was clearly supposed to be a reset. Kind of a soft relaunch, a little image repair, a little let's revisit the backlash with maturity and hindsight. But instead, it turned into another reminder of the exact reason people turned on her in the first place. Welcome back to The Critical Nerd. If you're new here, this channel covers Hollywood, entertainment, box office bombs, studio delusion, and all the ways these people keep stepping on their own rake and then acting shocked when it hits them in the face. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for coming back, and you already know the drill. Low expectations, high receipts. So today we need to talk about Rachel Zegler's new round of comments about the Snow White backlash. Because the media is framing this like a story about identity, harassment, and survival. But the real story is, well, a lot simpler than that. This was supposed to be a comeback interview, and instead, it just confirmed that Hollywood still has a massive accountability problem. So let's break it down. So in the new interview that got picked up by Entertainment Weekly, Deadline, Variety, Fox News, and basically everybody else under the sun, Rachel Zegler revisits the backlash over her casting of Snow White and everything that spiraled out from there. And the headline quote, the one that everybody ran with, is the idea that she refuses to assimilate for anybody else's comfort. Now, to be fair, there absolutely were people who fixated on her ethnicity and treated the casting backlash like a racial purity test. That happened. Even mainstream coverage is very clear that she got criticism over being Colombian American in a role tied to a character named Snow White, and Zegler herself says that was really confusing because she had previously been told she wasn't enough of one thing for West Side Story and too much of another for Snow White. That part is real, but here's the problem. That's not the whole story. And frankly, that is not even the part of the saga that did the most damage. Because what the mainstream coverage keeps soft pedaling is that Rachel Zegler did not just face backlash for being cast, she also spent the promotional cycle publicly trashing pieces of the original movie, reframing the character in very on-the-nose modernized terms, and injecting herself into controversy over and over again while fronting a giant Disney release. The fan site and commentary coverage is far more direct about that pattern. And that is where the story goes from unfair backlash exists to you're actively making things worse. Here's the key quote that tells you everything. Zegler says she still stands by what she said. She says essentially, I've said what I feel, and that it reflects her core beliefs. But then she also adds that the whole ordeal became a lesson in intent versus impact, and that the temptation to speak does not always mean you should. Now, on paper, that sounds like growth, but only on paper, because that's not accountability. That's the Hollywood version of accountability, which is, I'm not wrong, but I have learned that being publicly wrong looking can create consequences. That's not the same thing. She's not really saying, I mishandled this. She's not really saying, I disrespected the audience. She's not really saying, I turned the conversation into a circus when my job was to sell a movie. She is saying, I did not anticipate how big the blowback would be. That's different, and that difference matters. Because if your lesson from a public disaster is simply, wow, the internet was mean, then you haven't actually learned the part that would prevent it from happening again. And honestly, that's the part people can smell from a mile away. Let's talk about the timing because that matters here too. This interview did not land in a vacuum. It landed after Snow White became one of Disney's most embarrassing live-action misfires. And after months of the film being treated as shorthand for a big budget studio mess, commentary outlets are openly framing this press cycle as the beginning of a comeback attempt. And even the more neutral mainstream pieces read like a reputation recalibration. And that is why the reaction has been so brutal. Because people are not reading this as some spontaneous moment of honesty. They're reading it as PR. It's a reset, a repositioning. Let's get Rachel back in the conversation, but in a sympathetic way this time. And look, maybe that sounds a little cynical, but welcome to Hollywood. That's what these interviews are. Nobody accidentally ends up in a glossy feature revisiting a major career controversy. That is intentional. That is message management. That is reputation rehab. And if that was the goal here, well, it backfired. Because instead of sounding reflective, the interview made a lot of people feel like she was still explaining the backlash, mostly in terms of what happened to her, rather than what she did inside the blast radius. That is why the reaction online has been less, "Oh wow, she's grown," and more, "Yeah, you still don't get it." And this is the bigger point, the one Hollywood never wants to say out loud. Studios do not actually care that much if a celebrity has opinions. Please. Half of Hollywood has opinions. That's not the issue. The issue is when a star becomes unpredictable, polarizing, and commercially toxic at the same time. That's the unforgivable combo. Because if you're the face of a giant movie, especially a Disney movie, your first job is not to turn every press opportunity into a cultural TED Talk. Your first job is to, well, sell the movie. Protect the brand. Protect the release. Protect the hundreds of people below the line whose work depends on that project not becoming a meme. That is why this whole saga still matters. Because Rachel Zegler is not just one actress with a big mouth. She is a case study in something larger. Hollywood spent years mistaking online visibility for audience goodwill. They confused follower counts with ticket buyers. They confused viral clips with public affection. And then they acted stunned when the box office receipts showed up with a very different opinion. That's the lesson. Not the internet is mean or criticism equals bigotry. Not everyone just couldn't handle a modern Snow White. The lesson is that audiences do not like being lectured by a star of the thing they're being asked to buy. It's really that simple. Now, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. If Rachel Zegler received threats to her safety, that is disgusting and completely out of bounds. She says the backlash escalated to that point, and multiple write-ups of the interview repeated that claim. No movie disagreement, no casting debate, no online backlash should ever cross into that territory. But even here, the reason the interview is not landing the way her defenders hoped is because the audience can separate two things at once. One, no one should be threatened. Two, you can still have played a major role in creating the PR disaster around your own movie. Those two things can both be true. And that is what makes this story messy. Because yes, some of the backlash was ugly. Yes, some of it was unfair. Yes, some people took it way too far. But it is also true that Rachel Zegler repeatedly fed the machine. And when you never really acknowledge that part, when you keep talking around it instead of through it, people don't see growth, they see spin. So no, I don't think the real takeaway from this new interview is that Rachel Zegler is bravely standing tall against the haters. And I don't think the real takeaway is that she deserves every ugly thing that came her way either. The real takeaway is much more uncomfortable for Hollywood. Rachel Zegler became the face of a box office disaster, and even now, the industry still wants to frame that mostly as a backlash story instead of an accountability story. And that is why people are still talking about her. Because this keeps happening. A celebrity detonates goodwill, the studio loses the room, the media writes a sympathy piece, and then everybody acts confused when the audience says, no, you're still skipping the most important chapter. That chapter is called, maybe the audience wasn't mad just because you existed. Maybe they were mad because you kept talking like they didn't matter. And until Rachel Zegler, and honestly, Hollywood in general, figures that out, this comeback is going to keep looking less like a redemption arc and more like a, we'll say, rebrand number 8. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me know in the comments. Did Rachel Zegler actually learn anything from Snow White? Or is Hollywood once again trying to sell image repair as personal growth? And I'll see you in the next one.